Hello and welcome to Dialogue. The first 100 days of Trump's second presidency have sent shock waves across the world. While he promises to bring peace to conflicts like the Ukraine crisis, abide by the U.S. Constitution and enrich American citizens in his inaugural address, the Trump administration may have in fact done the opposite. How should we understand the decisions Trump has made since January? Has he fulfilled the promises he made to the American people during his election campaign? And what has been his impact on the world during the first 100 days in office? Join us for discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Ray Baker, adjunct professor of Towson University, Anthony Moretti, associate professor of Robert Morris University, Benjamin Norton, founder and editor-in-chief of the Geopolitical Economy Report, Benoit Hardy-Chartrand, a faculty lecturer of political science and international affairs of Temple University, Japan. Welcome to the show. So, Ben, I will start with you. If you look at the recent opinion poll, many of them show that, including the ones, done by Fox News, showing that Trump's overall approval rating at this stage of his presidency is the lowest of any president in the past 80 years. I wonder, what do you make of these numbers?
Well, you have to look at the issue by issue when you look at the poll, this Fox News poll. And if you look at issues like the economy and inflation, Trump is especially unpopular. And that makes sense because the reason that Trump won the 2024 presidential election is not because he was popular. It's because the Democrats were even more unpopular, largely due to the situation of the economy. Now, around the world, there was a bout of inflation following the COVID-19 pandemic and the supply chain disruption caused by lockdowns. And so around the world where there were elections that were held, incumbent parties lost most of those elections due to inflation being blamed on the incumbent parties. So Biden was blamed for the high rates of inflation, and polls showed that in the 2024 election, around 2/3 of U.S. voters said that the economy was the most important issue in determining their vote, and in particular, inflation was a very big issue. Inflation hit a multi-decade high in the U.S. of around 9%, which is the highest since the late 1970s. So Trump claimed that he was going to bring down the cost of goods, bring down the cost of food, but ironically, his tariffs and his trade war on countries around the world, but in particular on China, which the U.S. imports more from China than from any other country. And what does China export to the U.S.? A lot of important electronics goods, but also consumer goods, including textiles and plastic products and furniture, the kinds of things that average consumers in the U.S. buy at, especially low-income consumers buy at places like Walmart. The cost of those goods has already increased in anticipation of supply chain disruptions due to the sky-high Trump tariffs of 145% on China. So Trump, he violated the most basic promises he made to his voters, which is why even among many Republicans who voted for Trump, there is so much widespread anger and the feeling that people are being squeezed because real wages have not kept up with inflation, which is already increasing yet again. And Trump's tariffs and trade war are just making all of the situation even worse.
Ray, what about people's sentiment about, during the first 100 days about other issues, promises made by the president, during the campaign, for example, immigration, diversity, education, etc.?
Yeah. One of the things that we are seeing is that when people are not able to come through and deliver to the people that elected them materially, this is largely talking about economics, then they pivot toward cultural issues. Cultural issues have always been a useful divide whenever there are material ways that people are hurting. And so if the price of eggs has not come down, then look at the person next to you and let's deport them. If the cost of gasoline, or if the cost of your clothing, or if the cost of, transporting your kids to school or getting a new car has not come down or has not been easier in your life, then let's blame it on this person who has some job that pays well that we are telling you did not earn their job because of diversity, equity, or inclusion or something other like that. And so for those folks who are supportive of the idea or the belief that there are people getting things that they do not deserve, President Trump has done a good job to those people because he's gone and identified those folks as enemies of the state. We've seen the executive branch, which is the president of the United States here, we've seen him weaponize his executive office against people who are getting things that they do not deserve. And there's a very us versus them ideology around that. But the question becomes, who is us and who is them?
Mm-hmm. Well said there. Anthony, I mean, I wonder, how do you characterize the first 100 days of President Trump's policies?
This may sound trivial, and I apologize if it is, but, if you've ever seen a pinball in a pinball machine, it goes all over the place, and there's lights over here, and there's more lights over here, and everybody kind of stares at the screen or at the points as it continues to go higher and higher and higher. The problem is that obviously this is not a game. And what the president is doing is deciding that this is guaranteed policy today. Well, maybe it's not tomorrow. I'll blame somebody else for the mistake on Wednesday. I'll pivot back to the original idea on Thursday. And by the time we get to the end of the week, everybody is exhausted. And so I think when you take those first two questions that you asked your guests, if you put them together, I think the unifying element is that Americans would really like to know, do you have a plan? Are you going to stick to it? And then run it out and let's see what happens. If you're committed to tariffs, however flawed a policy it is, then commit to tariffs, but do so honestly, explaining to the American public and to American businesses that you're going to pay more for things. If you're going to make promises to end wars in 24 hours and you can't, then explain why you're not able to do it. This is a presidency that is very much based on, a sort of, I will do this because I can. And the problem is that's not very good leadership. More importantly, it doesn't get a lot of things done. So both the optics and the results are failures.
Mm-hmm. Benoit, you are Canadian. You live in Japan. I mean, look from outside. What do you see during the first 100 days of Trump's reign here?
Right. Well, as a non-American, it has been indeed quite a remarkable 100 days. I've been following politics for my whole adult life for the last 20 years, and as a Canadian, of course, I've always followed very closely American politics. And I and my colleagues as well do not recall a more eventful first 100 days for any president in my adult life, and probably for other presidents before that as well. And as you mentioned in your question, in your introduction, I'm a Canadian, and obviously Canada has been the brunt of some of the pretty negative rhetoric from the Trump administration over the last 100 days. As you all know, at the beginning of right after his inauguration, he started making threats to the sovereignty of Canada and calling, for example, the former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Governor Trudeau, calling Canada the 51st state of the United States. All of this did not go very well, of course, in Canada, and is part of the reason why, very unexpectedly, just a few months ago, everybody expected the Conservatives to win the election that occurred yesterday in Canada. But that's one of the reasons why we are going to continue to see another Liberal administration in Canada. This is only the example of Canada, of course, but there are many other allies of the United States that have been quite taken aback by the way that Donald Trump has treated other allies. As you mentioned, I've been based in Japan now for more than 10 years. And Japan as well has been very concerned, very preoccupied by the way that Donald Trump has treated it. Of course, the tariffs that were imposed on Japan, now they're on pause. But from the perspective of Japan, seeing its closest security ally talk about an unfair alliance, talk about renegotiating this alliance. This is something that is very dangerous for Japan and is probably going to lead the country to rethink its partnerships around the world. And of course, I just mentioned two countries now, Japan and Canada, but that is the same for many other American partners and allies. So quite an eventful first 100 days for the Trump administration.
Eventful 100 days. Benoit, stick to this foreign affairs, arena here. Some people say Donald Trump is isolationist. Some say, but at the same time, we do see some of the policies can be described as expansionist. When he talked about Canada, Greenland, Gaza, and of course Panama Canal. Recently he said, U.S. ships should be paid zero, basically, in terms of passing through Canada Canal or Suez Canal. What do you make of these remarks, these ideas?
Yeah, well, it's very much possible to be both. You can be both an expansionist and an isolationist. And Donald Trump has shown a proclivity towards both in the first 100 days, which is very much unlike the first term, where there was no such expansionist rhetoric coming from the White House. And one thing that I have found particularly fascinating, remarkable, is the fact that although we've always known that Donald Trump is somebody who is not particularly internationally minded, he's certainly not a liberal institutionalist, doesn't care very much for international institutions like the UN, for example. This has been cranked up to 12 since the beginning of his second administration. We are seeing now a United States who has almost entirely relinquished its role, its international role, which many people are going to say is a good thing. But of course, for a lot of American allies who have always wanted to see a strong United States playing an important role when it comes to security, when it comes to trade, when it comes to democracy promotion, and of course I'm thinking of Japan and other countries in the region as well. This has been quite disconcerting to see, to say the least. So definitely a very remarkable change in direction for the first part of the Trump administration.
Well, Ray, let's take a look at the way the Trump administration governs in terms of domestic policies. For example, he relies heavily on executive orders. He signed over 140 executive orders, more than probably the entire Biden administration. Some people are asking whether the opposition party, the Democratic Party, and the legislature, of course, the Congress, somehow being sidelined or marginalized even. What do you say about his style in terms of governing this country?
I appreciate my colleague who alluded to both and rather than either or when talking about the expansionist versus isolationist policy. And I think here domestically, particularly with the use of executive orders, President Trump, and to be fair to President Trump, the brain trust behind President Trump, because I think it's important that viewers recognize that President Trump himself is not a theoretician, is not any kind of direct ideologue, where he himself has thought about these macro level ideas and looks to exact them. But there are a number of people that work in and around the White House that are supportive to the White House, that are the ideas persons behind these kind of things. We're thinking now of people like Stephen Miller. We're thinking of the director of the Heritage Institute. And so a number of folks who have access to President Trump, who are able to feed him these ideas, allow him to be both and. He is a man who says he's deeply committed to law and order, while also rejecting the institution of the judiciary, arresting one judge already, and offering the rhetoric that suggests that he believes that judiciary is acting in an activist manner beyond the pale that is allowed or allotted to them by the Constitution. Specifically to the executive orders, that is a place where a president and their team can communicate their ideological values. For example, President Trump has issued executive orders writing about the ways that diversity, equity, and inclusion have harmed the United States, writing about restoring sanity to national museums and places of the sort, while referencing individualism 5, 7, 10 different times in those executive orders, rarely ever referencing any idea of a collectivism or a communal spirit, this idea of a united in the United States. Why might that matter? Because one of the other values and operating phrases that the United States enjoys is the e pluribus unum. Out of many, one. We saw President Barack Obama have to use this as a unifying factor when there are a disparate number of Americans who may not have agreed with him for policy reasons, for ideological reasons, and more crassly for racial reasons. And so when President Trump issues his executive orders that repeat the merits and values of individualism, he is then trumpeting this notion that we as Americans must move out and fend for ourselves, a term of the rugged individualism. And this is not to assume or to suggest that the state should be our patriarch, but this is to say what type of president, what type of leadership, what type of ideas is the president trying to communicate through his executive orders, where rarely he is asking the country to come together and move in a unified space, but instead is accelerating, incentivizing, and prioritizing the value of the individual at the expense of their fellow neighbor.
Well, Ben, I mean, some of the ideas, some of the concepts, I think a lot of people are with the president. For example, downsizing the bureaucracy, increasing the efficiency. I think a lot of people would say, yes, that's the way to go. For many countries, probably, not only to the U.S., but also for other countries. And also diversity issue, probably the Democrats, have gone too far, and you need to roll back a little bit. Immigration, yes, headache for, passing through many administrations. But, why people are not happy with the way it is handled, right?
Well, I would be very skeptical of the idea that that people in the U.S. agree on all of those issues. The U.S. is a very deeply divided country. And on a lot of these issues, if you look at polling, it often falls pretty evenly, 50-50, depending on what the specific issue is, and also depending on the way that the question is framed. So, for instance, if you look at polling on DOGE, this is the Department of Government Efficiency that was created by Elon Musk, who's the world's richest man. And he said that he was going to cut down the fat of the government, as he put it. He claimed he was going to remove trillions of dollars from the government deficit. In reality, the government deficit's increasing, but what he has been doing is cutting many aspects of the U.S. government that he sees as unworthy, especially targeting social programs, education. The Trump administration has been gutting public health. And at the same time, Trump says he's going to increase the military budget to $1 trillion. $1 trillion. So, I mean, in reality, if you look at polls on DOGE, people say, yes, of course we want to cut inefficiency and corruption. No one in the world says I support corruption and inefficiency. But what they're doing is redefining corruption and efficiency to basically say all of the aspects of the state that involve social services and that help average people, we're going to cut those while expanding the punitive apparatus of the state, including the military, including police. And by the way, a very important part of this is that the Republican-controlled Congress, the House passed a bill that will increase spending on the military and also that will likely cut U.S. government spending on Medicaid, which is health care for poor Americans, and also food stamps, the SNAP program. So once again, we see that the priority of the Trump administration is to cut taxes on the rich and cut taxes on corporations, and then increase taxes on poor and working people through tariffs, because tariffs are a regressive tax. They're a tax on consumption. And because lower income people have a higher marginal propensity to consume, tariffs hit them much harder than rich people. So Trump is moving the burden of taxation off of the rich onto the poor, while at the same time trying to cut social programs and increase the military budget. So I think we have to be very careful when we look at polling about things like cutting government spending and look at the way that the question is asked. And you see that, the U.S. is very divided, and a lot of people, they thought that Trump was going to help them. And the reason that he's now become so unpopular is because even a lot of independents, of course, diehard Republicans still support him, but where Trump has really lost support is among independents who had voted for him. And they're seeing that Trump's policies are actually hurting them and benefiting many of the billionaires around Trump. There are 13 billionaires in the Trump administration.
So, Ben, are you saying that the Trump government is a bit similar to previous Republican government in terms of, tax cutting for the rich and increasing the military budget?
Oh, of course. I mean, this is just Reaganism. Trump, in many ways, has continued with a lot of Reagan's policies. Even, by the way, Reagan is seen as a free marketeer, but actually Reagan put 100% tariffs on Japan in 1987, targeting Japan's high-tech sector, including semiconductors. So we see some kind of historical deja vu here. Trump thought he could do the same thing to China, but of course, China is very different from Japan. Its economy is much bigger. It's much more independent. But yeah, I think in many ways, Trump has some unorthodox elements about him. But when it comes to many of his policies, especially his economic policies, they're not that different from previous Republicans.
Anthony, on the tariff issue, of course, it affects not only the Americans but also the rest of the world. The idea is like to have as many deals as possible within 90 days. Where are we now? Are we expecting any deals to be reached, in the near future?
If you listen to President Trump, the people are lining up and they can't wait to make a deal with him. And this is another example of the rhetoric is not matching the results. Let's face it, if there were deals, you would hear about them, whether it's a government source on the US side or somewhere around the world leaking the information to some journalist somewhere. We would hear about a deal. We would hear about parameters of a deal, about agreements on this issue, disagreements on those issues. In other words, things would not be kept secret. So I am very skeptical of the idea that governments around the world are simply lining up, one after the other to try to get a deal made with this president. I think there was a very important, but maybe lost in all of the maelstrom of the international news of late. Just a couple of days ago, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom came together with the president of the European Commission of the European Union, rather, sorry, and said, look, we need to work closer and better and together. And if you think about it, it was just a couple of years ago that the United Kingdom looked at the European Union and said, we want no part of you. And obviously Brexit unfolded and we know the history associated with that. So I think it was an important, and I don't think just symbolic, I think there was a lot of substance behind it. Looking at the Prime Minister of the UK and saying, look, we could side with the United States, we could side with the EU, we could try to go it alone. But the reality is we see stability on the European side that we don't see in the United States. Likewise, there's stability emanating from China that is not emanating from the United States. There is this saying that, flee to safety in times of crisis. And right now, if you look at the areas of the world where there is stability, obviously, because of the economic force that China is and the policies that it is pursuing that support and uphold the idea of a multipolar world, the idea of win-win cooperation, etc., that kind of message is going to be very well received, especially when you look at sort of the flip side of that coin, if you will, and you look at the United States, and you're not quite sure what this president will do, will not do, if he'll hold to a promise, if he'll simply deny that the promise was ever going to be made. And then as you look at this then long term, which is something that obviously we really won't be able to determine immediately for obvious reasons, but what will happen 4, 5, 7, 10 years from now as the decisions made today by governments all over the world play out and the effects of those decisions begin to become obvious. I think you'll see China and the European Union, but definitely China, be stronger. And I don't think there's any question the United States on some levels it will be found to be weaker.
Ray, what about the domestic response to those tariffs? Do you think the public is with the government in terms of imposing tariffs on, basically the rest of the world?
Yeah, there's been mixed responses because, as we've heard from some of our colleagues earlier, There's the idea or the rhetoric around the tariffs, and there are Americans who feel enthusiastic about that. Yeah, let's make others pay for what they're sending into us. Yeah, let's bring back jobs here in the United States, because rhetorically, a number of Americans are believing what President Trump is suggesting, that manufacturing jobs will return, that those who do not have formal education will be able to get high-paying jobs through skilled manufacturing, that the days of skilled manufacturing and industrialism here in the United States are going to return on account of those tariffs. Economically and practically, all of the information from the economic scholars and experts that we have suggest that is not true. Additionally, as we've heard before, tariffs will be regressive because low-income workers are primarily consumers, and this will be effectively against them. And so while there is a literal policy of suggesting a tax cut for the rich, we're also seeing a functional tax cut for the rich. And what we will find is, as we've heard earlier, President Trump was elected because Americans were unhappy with their material experience, their living wages, the cost of goods during the Biden administration, and the Democratic candidate, Ms. Harris, was a representation of that administration. Well, what then will Americans do when they find that the two-party system that they are being offered, neither of those parties are serving their interests? Neither of those parties are relieving their material strain that they feel from the cost of goods and services, from the low wages they feel they're receiving from their work, from the continued bifurcation of the American society, where there is no longer a middle class. There is a very, very, very rich class, and there is an exploited working class. And there are some people who believe that because they make good wages, that they will be okay. Those folks believe that the tariffs will not affect them. They are in for a rude awakening, and I think ultimately the tariffs are where you ask this question, but our conclusion will ultimately lead us to what political party, what political person, what political entity will then go back to serving in the physical material needs of Americans, and that was where the American public will turn. In the short term, the rhetoric about tariffs are exciting to a number of Trump supporters, are terrible to those who are already against President Trump, but what we see the implications, as our colleague said, 4, 5, 7 years later, when we see the implications, there will be a large conclusion that neither of the two major American parties are serving the American people. What then will the American public do? That remains to be seen.
Well, Benoit, Canada is one of the most important trading partner of the United States. I mean, Canada is also under tariffs, like at least 25% there. Now you have this new Prime Minister, Mark Carney. How will he respond to, in terms of negotiation with the U.S. or responding with the U.S. tariffs on Canada?
Well, already the Prime Minister of Canada, so he was reelected yesterday, but he has been in office now for about 2 months. And he has made it very clear over the last 2 months that the old days of the traditional relationship between Canada and the United States is over. Although he will, of course, and has talked about negotiating with the United States, the days of Canada being entirely dependent on the American market. He wants this to be gone. Already over the last 10, 20 years, this is not limited to the current prime ministers, but successive prime ministers of Canada have spoken about diversifying their trade. However, not much has been done to really make this a reality. But now with the Trump tariffs, with the trade war, there's never been greater impetus on the Canadian government to truly make this a reality. Already over the last couple of years, Canada has tried to increase or to reinforce its trading partnerships in East Asia, including with Japan, South Korea, India, and also China. But we're also going to see Canada try to do that with other partners in Europe, for example. So we're truly seeing Canada, as well as other U.S. allies and partners, trying increasingly to hedge their bets against the United States.
So can we say this is probably more serious in terms of reducing dependence on the U.S.?
No, absolutely. This is what they all want because, of course, having 80% of your trade being hedging on one particular country, that is not very healthy for the future. And the Prime Minister of Canada has made this very clear. He himself is an economist. He was the former head of the English Bank, for example, of the Federal Bank of England. So he knows exactly what to do going forward, and we're going to see greater moves in order to lessen the independence on on the dependence rather on the United States.
On the United States. Well, with that note, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.